All right, hi. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay, so my inquiry question was, what strategies can educators employ in synchronous e-learning environments to ensure that high school students at risk to receive a failing grade are given the proper support in order to pass? The outcomes aligned with my inquiry are: one, understand the roles, responsibilities, and ethics of effective teachers; two, reflect on current issues and trends in education and their impact on educational practice; and three, examine classroom issues such as climate routines and classroom management. So back to the question, looking at strategies that clearly applies to the first and third outcomes of the class, and thinking now what is more on the current collective mind than COVID. So COVID, obviously for a while, sent everybody online, and now we're kind of in this weird in between state where some schools, some states are able to be in person for classes, others are outside. Some classes actually have a mix of both. That's where my brothers, who are both in high school, they are both kind of like in that hybrid situation where some students are in synchronous online environments, others are in class. So we're in a weird place right now, but I do think it's clear that the online educational component that we really were forced to pick up on is it's not going away. So moving forward, looking at why I chose this. So I did touch on that before. So one, the COVID-19 pandemic really kind of forced the issue, and it was, kind of dwelling in my headspace for a while. Also, throughout my college years, I, really did experiment a lot with online classes, and I found that I could handle one or two in a semester, but really that was the maximum for me. I really benefit from being in person with a teacher, able to ask them questions ongoing, and just having that physical shared environment is really important for me. But now I am completely online, and that is completely through necessity. So that's something that I am working on the student side. And at the same time, my first teaching experience below the college level has been teaching a day of middle schoolers completely through Zoom, and engaging those students, making sure that they were participating in the lesson, connecting with the information I was, disseminating, was extraordinarily difficult. So looking at the strategies to really ensure that, I'm connecting with students as a teacher is really important to me. Okay, so just looking at the structure of this presentation and the structure of my inquiry as a whole, there's really four different categories that I went to. One was kind of taking a step back and taking a meta bird's eye look at my inquiry and looking at the research, the empirical research available. So I have a meta analysis to share with that too, looking at a portrait of the passing student, also looking at a portrait of the failing student. And lastly, we're going to be looking at strategies for improving engagement in the synchronous online environment. So let's get started. So first, the meta-analysis. Now, let me tell you, I've been doing lit searches for years now. Maybe, for a professor, just a few years of doing it, might seem, might not seem the biggest thing, but, pretty much my entire time in higher education, I've been doing lit searches just all the time. So I do feel, pretty comfortable with it. But let me tell you, this was the most frustrating lit search I've ever had to do by a lot. And that's really because there was not a lot of research that I could find that really tackled my question head on. One, looking at online education, there was a huge emphasis on learner engagement. It felt like every single study had to do in some way with engagement or participation at the online synchronous level. Two, there were barely any studies that I could find in the K through 12 sector. Through UMSL's database, I think I found one that actually was purely designed for K-12, and it was a Chinese study, and it also had nothing to do with what my inquiry was on. So that the one study I found in the K-12 sector dealing directly with my inquiry was a dud. So that was frustrating. And lastly, there was a big lack of learner outcome studies. And learner outcomes, it's a big topic, but looking specifically at grades, dealing with my inquiry, I really couldn't find much. And the one I did find, I did include. Now that frustration, at first I was like, man, I might need to change my inquiry question. I thought I had a great one. I thought I was really strong here, but I just kind of kept trucking on, and I did find a meta-analysis that confirmed all of my perceptions here. One, within the online education research, 29% of those studies all looked at student engagement. This was the most common theme by far. The next closest was 20%. I don't remember exactly what it was, but engagement was clearly kind of the big one that the researchers were looking at. Two, only 5% studied learner outcomes, which was, I think, the third or fourth least common theme, which is tough because I'm specifically looking at the outcome of passing or failing a class, just strictly looking at the grade. And taking only 5% of the studies and looking at one portion of learner outcome as the variable sits as a whole, that was really tough. And lastly, 68% of studies were in the higher education sample, only 9% in the K through 12. This makes a lot of sense. It's mostly the universities who are doing this research, and universities, if they don't have a lack in anything, it's not a lack in students. So they have subjects to look at. So that was the big result of my inquiry, is that there's a huge need for research looking at my inquiry, which is an interesting answer there. But continuing on, let's look at a portrait of the passing student. This was an interesting study I found with 112 English as a foreign language undergraduates, with a research question of how is student participation, or how does student participation relate to students receiving a passing grade in an online class. And the way they define student participation were within three major domains. One was student-teacher interaction, another was student-student interaction, and lastly was group discussion. So I have those correlational coefficients there, which are all extremely strong, and these are positive correlational effects between student participation and a passing grade. So 0.884 for student-teacher interaction, 0.879 for student-student interaction, 0.904 for group discussion. This might look like common sense, at first glance. It's like, what is one of the preconditions for succeeding in a class? It's obviously participating in the class. You can't not participate and get a passing grade. But the reason this really stuck with me were one, those three, subdomains of student participation, and two, the connection between student participation and student engagement, which we are going to talk about a little bit later. But just looking at the strength of those correlations, I come from a psychology background, and finding those correlations at that strength is, it's really unheard of. Usually if you see something like that in psychology, you've done something wrong. There's some sort of conflation between two variables that you thought were different, but are really a little bit more connected than they really are. So this was really interesting to see. This really jumped out at me. So portrait of the passing student, one, they have to participate, which is a big one, especially within the online sector. So let's continue on. Here's a portrait of the failing student. This one was also really interesting. So there was a survey administered to community college students, 438 of them, who all failed an online course. And the big question was, okay, what are the perceptions of these students for the reason that they failed this course? there are four top reported reasons for student failure. One was I got behind and it was too hard to catch up. Two, I had personal problems. Three, I couldn't handle combined study plus work or family responsibilities. And four, I didn't like the online format. So that first one is big. So it's you have to, stay in tune. You have to stay in line with the work as it comes. You can't, get swamped down. And that is a huge thing for online courses. Looking, a lot of students can feel overwhelmed with, all of the extra duties that they have. One, they're just taking a course that can be difficult. And two, it's completely online. So especially for new students, that one is tough. Then you have personal problems, contextual issues outside of school, which, deals heavily with the second and third top reported reasons. And lastly, I didn't like the online format. This is really big. So we kind of get a little bit of a discrepancy when we take this study and the last study together as one. One, the passing student participates, especially when it comes to group discussions. That's a big one. And the failing student, they have some different reasons. So, maybe, an interesting follow-up study with this is looking at failing students and seeing how they participated. You can see participation in the first reason, I got behind and it was too hard to catch up. Those, might go hand in hand. It'd be interesting to see how those two correlate. Let's keep moving here. I'm running out of time. Okay, so going back to that meta-analysis, looking at how 30% of the studies within the online sector had to do with engagement, that really, to me, the big takeaway there was that engagement is seen as a precondition, a requirement for successful online learning. And so since in the absence of, explicit empirical studies dealing with my inquiry, I kind of had to take a little bit of a circumventual route to where I, kind of had to attack things as they came. So this one is a battery study looking at college students, again, 26 of them after an online course. And the research question was, how do pre-recorded video lectures increase student engagement and outcomes? And they found a decent correlation between student engagement in a pre-recorded video lecture and their grade, which is 420. And in turn, an even greater correlation in their participation in synchronous e-learning sessions and their engagement in those pre-recorded video lectures. Now, this research suggests, one, that synchronous learning environments can't just be that. They need to be supplemented by asynchronous activities, whether that's a pre-recorded lecture or some sort of activity, and one that's going to help the students' grades, and two, it's going to increase participation in synchronous online sessions, which, as we already saw with that portrait of the passing student in the online world, is big. Participation is big there. Okay, so now looking at kind of the weaknesses to the studies that I found for my inquiry, and this also connects back to that meta-analysis. One was no high school studies. I found a couple, none of them had anything to do with what I was looking for, which was, frustrating to say the least. But, that in a way is an answer to my inquiry. And it says, that we need more research dealing with K through 12 learning outcomes in the online sector, especially with synchronous learning environments. Also, I did already mention this, but there, were those two opposing conclusions with the portrait of the successful online student and the portrait of a non-successful online student. And what do we do with that? Well, they're not directly in opposition. Maybe, the variables that work for a passing student don't necessarily not work for a failing student. So I would also like to see more research looking at that, really taking a look at the differences between those who pass and fail online courses. And three, looking at participation and engagement as, the big golden goose of online online learning research, back to that successful student portrait study that I looked at, that was purely participation. And it's not necessarily engagement. I think those two variables are connected in a way. I think students who are engaged, are most likely going to participate, but pure participation by itself does not necessarily lead to engagement. So that's another interesting little tidbit of information that I found in my inquiry. And here we are at the last slide. Sorry, I'm going a little bit over, but so one, I had really struggled with finding research, dealing specifically with my inquiry. And it's good to know that, that might not necessarily be my fault, and that idea is supported by that meta-analysis that I found. And, I did find some information really dealing specifically what I was looking for, but they were all blog posts, they're all opinion pieces. None of them were cited at all. All of them were kind of sketchy almost too. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. But it's funny too, all of those had to do with engagement as well. So that's a funny little just pattern that we see. Online study and engagement are the two variables that just can't seem to be separated. And engagement and success within those learning outcomes, specifically within grades, has for a long time really been strongly demonstrated. So that extends, by proxy into the online world. That is an assumption I'm making, but I think the stress that the research places on engagement kind of helps support that conclusion that I come to. But also looking at, there's two things that are key. One, you got to get your students engaged. You got to get them participating, especially the ones that are struggling, because we know, as seen in that portrait of a passing student, the participation of a student is key within their, whether or not they pass or fail a class. Two, we need to supplement our synchronous environments with asynchronous lectures and activities. And what's that's going to do is, one, it's going to help their grades. So it's going to help the strategy part of my inquiry. That is a strategy. It's also going to help them. Actually, no, sorry. The supplementing synchronous environments with asynchronous lectures and activities, one is going to help their grade, as seen by that one correlation. So it's going to help the outcome of my inquiry. It's also going to increase their participation in the synchronous environment, which attacks kind of the other side of my inquiry, that synchronous side. Lastly, we need more K through 12 research on academic outcomes for online students. We just really need it. It's, I do understand, that, the resources getting that done is tough. And, it's easier for colleges to study their own students or study, students connected to another university. But we really do need more academic outcome research for online students. And before I go, I have to give some sort of a explicit inquiry answer. So the answer to my question is, maximizing student engagement and participation is a key strategy for ensuring that students receive a passing grade. And amongst the many strategies for increasing participation and engagement in synchronous activities for online students, supplementation of information with asynchronous lectures and activities is helpful. Here are my works cited, and thank you.